Hi, Charlotte Becker here. I'm planning to talk to you a little bit about what I've learned about meter through writing a couple of ballads. The first ballad that I wrote of the two that I've written is called The Sad Effects of Covetousness, or The Ponzi Schemer's Warning Piece. And it's a ballad that I wrote really as a narrative exercise. I wrote it to get a better handle on how ballads about crime worked in the early modern period and to learn how it felt to try to take a specific narrative and shape it into the sort of pattern that many of the ballads about crime in the 16th and 17th centuries that they used. So in that ballad, I tried to make the modern story of Bernie Madoff's conviction for fraud work with the pattern that early modern crime ballads tend to use, where there's a sort of reflection on the wickedness of the age, then some explanation of the specific crime, and then the punishment and sometimes repentance of the wrongdoer. So my focus in that ballad was really on narrative conventions and not at all on what it would be like to sing this ballad. I really didn't expect anyone to try to sing it. So the second ballad that I wrote was meant to be sung. It was for the Living English Broadside Ballads conference that took place at the Huntington Library in April 2014. So, like I said, this ballad was meant to be sung. It was on the conference program, and it was meant to enumerate the highlights of the conference. It was meant to mention the various presenters by name and sort of be a celebration of the event. So it was sort of styled after ballads that report on current events, like things that happened in Parliament or interesting news from other parts of the world, things like that. So that was my model there, but I was much more focused on what it would actually be like to sing this ballad, more so than the one about Bernie Madoff, which I didn't think anyone would sing. So the tune for the Huntington Conference ballad was Green Sleeves, which is, of course, a common ballad tune and one that many people still know today, so I was hoping that would make it somewhat easy for people to sing along. I also thought that that might make it easier for me to write a text that was compatible with that tune, since I was also familiar with it. In the ballad about Bernie Madoff, meant to be read and not sung, I kept the meter almost painfully regular, and I paid a lot of attention to rhyme scheme. I don't think that I was necessarily doing this consciously, but I think that since I was imagining people reading the ballad rather than singing it, I think I was sensing that the sort of hyper-irregular meter and fairly precise rhyme scheme would create the effect of the pattern, and would kind of take the place of the pleasure that a listener might get from the repeated pattern of a melody. So the meter that I came up with for the Bernie Madoff ballad is thoroughly iambic. So let me read you a stanza. Full 20 years did Madoff plot. He ponzied freely and unchecked. His friends grew fat, alas God wot, such ruin they did ne'er expect. So when I wrote the ballad for the Huntington Conference, I quickly found that the rigidity in terms of the number of syllables per line that I'd used with the Bernie Madoff ballad did not make for a very nice sounding song. So I realized that what I'd really been doing was overcrowding the melody by trying to sort of insist on a perfectly, in this case, anapestic meter, putting a new syllable everywhere that a series of anapests would have me put a new syllable, and in that way the melody sort of became plodding rather than pleasant. So an example of a place where I revised is the first line of the last stanza, which used to say, "To Sydney and London and Belfast we're bound." So when it was sung, my cat has just joined me on the couch here. When it was sung, and excuse my singing voice, I will not hit every note perfectly, but when it was sung, it sounded like this. To Sydney and London and Belfast we're bound. So when I heard that a few times, I thought, I don't need every syllable accounted for. I'll take out the first and in that line. So rather than da 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 da, I took out the and between Sydney and London, and it sounded like this. To Sydney, London, and Belfast we're bound, which sort of made the sound of that line of the melody a little smoother and more pleasant, I think. I have to say that I didn't really see the difference or even the point of making such a distinction until I heard the words that I had written for the Huntington Ballad being sung. I think now, if I were to write another ballad to be sung, I would be much freer about including irregular meter right from the start, knowing that this would make the ballad more musical and more pleasing to sing and to hear. And I think I might also be more strategic about using more complex meters that would sort of, take the silent reader pleasantly by surprise, since that I think can be more appealing when one is sort of singing silently in one's head than when one is really trying to, sometimes on the fly, match text to tune or to the ear. So I did discover in writing these two ballads that the I, maybe better called or thought of in this case as a silent ear, perceives and appreciates metrical regularity differently than the ear out loud does. So when one reads to oneself silently, or when perhaps a writer considers the silent reader, it seems that syllabic or metrical regularity actually becomes melodic. But out loud, it can sound kind of droning or plodding. In terms of irregular meter and its value to the eye and ear, I think in some of the lines of my Huntington Conference ballad, which was meant to be sung, it's not always obvious to the eye which of the syllables is going to take the stress, or which note sort of is going to correspond in the melody to the text. Because of course most ballads did not have interlineated text with musical notes, so the singer had to make some decisions about how the text and the meter would match up. And I know we've got a lot more to say about that elsewhere. So one particular line from the Huntington Ballad that I think demonstrates this is the line after the one that I quoted before about to Sydney, London, and Belfast were bound. The next line says, Edinburgh and Davis by air and on ground. And the word Edinburgh, I think, poses a little bit of a dilemma to a singer, and we certainly talked about that as we were practicing singing it. Where are we going to make the stress fall? And we ended up making it sound like this. Edinburgh and Davis by air and on ground. And I actually really like the way that you have to sort of punch forward into that line. I really like the way that the tune sounds there because the words aren't an obvious fit. So thank you for letting me share my very humble 2 cents about ballads and tunes and meters. I'm very glad that I'm not trying to get my living by writing ballads, but very glad to get to talk a little bit about this.